Bonjour.
Hello, thanks for being such a large number. For less people than this morning, not a problem. But we have the quality. My name is David Vanderberg. I'm a lecturer at the Louvain University. I'm thanking the organizer for having invited me to take part in this symposium. So I was not really convinced at the very beginning. I didn't understand at the beginning what was the interest of the archaic. But after hearing and reading the papers that will be presented now, I got convinced. I'm very glad of that. So, modus operandi for this afternoon.
La petite différence de la séance qui nous précède propose de laisser
the difference of the previous sequence, I'll leave some time after the end of each paper. I'll leave some room for Q&A, for clarifications. We keep 15 minutes per presentation, and I'll give you a little sign after 12 minutes. I'll do like that, and you see you have 3 minutes left. That's hence 3 fingers, and we'll leave a few minutes for the clarification. All this in the interest to have a time for a Q&A later, because the Q&A is precious. I defend the time. I'm the timekeeper. Very strict for the benefits of the Q&A. It's almost the end of the day. So inventions, it covers an epistemological range which is rather wide, from general to particular, from transcendency of philosophy to the role of an unrealized opus about the interrogation about movements within the architecture. I had a lot of pleasure reading those papers, even if, in the first stage, I was at pain to find what was the common ground. But as a good academic and faithful to Gerfo, I went on. Each and every paper talks or writes about a freeing potential of the archaic within a thought, an opus, or a movement, enabling to get out of problematic situations, dead ends to which we are confronted by the modern earthquake and its aftermath. It's not a way back, but a way to find a resource to move above sterile dialectics, take away the tyranny of the tools and give a new momentum to composition or non-composition. Homage to Mr. Lucan. I'll give 15 minutes for each and every presentation, and then we'll have more than half an hour for a general discussion. So let me introduce Alexei Sevastianov, architect, postmaster of DPA, Architecture and Philosophy of La Villette, preparing a dissertation on philosophy called Architecture and Non-Representable for a Criticism of Sublime, under the direction of Olga Schmidt at the Charles de Gaulle University. Text and Language, and the title is Archaic as a Method, Architecture and Schematism. As we have seen this morning and this afternoon also, the definition of archaism can lead to a thought, a reflection on the method of its own definition. Besides the definition of the archaic itself, which is difficult to define, as we have seen, how can we define the relation between architecture and archaism? Well, if we consider what is archaic as the beginning of architecture, aren't we falling into a Hegelian schema, where the value of the beginning is guaranteed by what it's going to become by being accomplished? Conversely, if we pose archaic to what is succeeding and denature it, what can we consider as the beginning and assign it a value? I'd like to explore a third possible way about this archaic dimension of architecture differently, not as a factitious origin, but as a principle, transcendental principle, as we can see, of the possibility of architecture. I didn't invent this way. It was suggested in an item, an article, Architecture, Appearance in the Practice of Imagination by Michael Hayes, where the author defines what he called the imagination in architecture through Kantian schematism. Beyond the notion of representation and different ways of doing architecture, there would be, according to Hayes, the primary and transcendental principle of archaic that would allow to think architecture to be thought as a schema, in other words, as a particular synthesis of a sensible given an intuition and concept of hearing, without dwelling on the highly problematic, very problematic question of the possibility or not of thematization, architectural thematization of Kantian schematism. I'd like to be interested in the strategy of using schematism as an attempt to find back this archaic scene that would not be thought as a factitious origin, but as a condition of possibility. To start with, we have to note that the relation between architecture and Kant are far from being simple. During this spatial turn, where we're opposing space to place, Kant, and we associated a new architecture to this concept of location opposed to space, the thought of Kant was on the side of universalism of the modern. Edward Casey, in his book The Fate of Place, criticized the position expressed in the phenomenology of the primality of knowledge, general knowledge, philosophical, on the local knowledge. We can allude to the trial of Par-delà in his book. About the philosophy of art, Jean-Marie Schaffer, the philosopher, highlights a regain of interest for Kant as of the end of the 90s, 80, beginning of the 90s. He wrote, non-negligible part of the institutional discourse about art, I think it could find in the judgment of taste a legitimation of the hierarchy of the works that could be come in lieu of the other justification of the history. It's a attempt to think about the modern art, and also the concept of Jean-François Lyotard, in his book about the analysis of the sublime, published in 88 and 91, was presenting the recourse to the Kantian aesthetics as a possibility for art, for abstract painting mainly, but not only for that, because Lyotard talks about Le Corbusier and his trip to the East. Jacques Lecoq talked about that this morning. He talked about this possibility of art to put an end to representation. We were then, according to Lyotard, in the distinction between the judgment, determining judgment of science, let's say, and aesthetic judgment. I'm quoting, thinking about Kant, it's easy to show that we never deal with a massive reason, unique reason, an ideology. We deal conversely to rationalities, plural, theoretical, practical, that are deeply heterogeneous, self-standing, as Kant says. Rationality, theoretical one, could never explain the action of the aesthetics because they don't share the same territory. Territory is Kant's word. Hayes recurs to Kant to evacuate from architecture the notions of representation and description. Architecture is not a language, it's a practice of creation of images, where those are comprehended not as a representation, but as a revelation of truth of the world, as an operation giving an appearance to the world. From this point of view, architecture is not a knowledge, but a recognition. It's done like the scheme of imagination formulated in the first and stated in the third critic. According to Kant, the scheme is a product of imagination, in between intuition and knowledge. It's this third thing that enables us to associate the sensible with a concept and define an object. The example of the scheme is the triangle. Without a specific triangle, we have a concept enabling us to recognize this triangle in the sensible. Generalizing like Deleuze is doing in the seminary, we can talk about the scheme of a line, taking into account the concept of the third criticism, the imagination, is the most powerful of the faculties, can give an aesthetic judgment, given that the schematism of interest is the one of the third criticism. Hayes writes that the scheme can be stabilizing the concept, but it's also possible to find indexes of liberation in the different ways, complexifying the constructive process. Schematism, which is in work in the Kantian, schematism will then, according to Hayes, be a model enabling to understand the evolution of the discipline of architecture as a configuration of the sensitive without closing it into a rigid concept. Wittcover for Palladio's villas into the panopticon of Bantam revealed by Foucault, architecture would be a way of thinking and a scheme where the sensible space can vary and be superimposed, like in Deleuze's work, keeping their order, schematic order. So the reading of Deleuze of the diagram of Hayes is the dominating model of the visible in the architecture, while the scheme of Kant would be something like a model for the diagram. It's before becoming concept, extracting architecture from the representation without giving away autonomy. Scheme could be defined as a diagram of diagrams, an architectural universal diagram because it is transcendental. I'll quote Hayes again, architecture is do and redo the world, territorialization and re-territorialization of the concrete through the architectural diagram. If the scheme is a template, says Hayes, diagrams is a framework and a connector. End quote. This is the general interest of the architectural scheme, highlighting probably the tracks of the critical approach of Hayes in the 80s, enabling to reconcile the difference of inspiration of Deleuze with the transcendental universality of Kant. It's an attempt. It's an architectural way of doing it. In the 70s, in a text written on the occasion of the exhibition Main Transforms, Oswald Matthias Ungers suggested the schematism of Kant as a model of renewal of the architectural thought. It was in the case of Ungers to justify his morphological approach of town planning, recurring to a multiple rationality including the idea of scheme. It was not about an architectural scheme, but about an idea of the capacity of imagination of architecture to interact with the complex reality using images, metaphors, analogies, models, symbols, allegories that are subject of the Kantian schematism. Interpretation of Hayes seems very different, where Unger sees a general mechanism of interpretation of reality to the service of architecture. Hayes considers the scheme as thinking architecture itself as heterogeneity. In the argument called Architecture Before Speech, in January 2018 in Harvard, Hayes organized with Folder. Thank you, Stéphane Bonzani, for this reference. This idea of projection of today's architecture, according to Hayes and Holder, highlighted by the pre-discursive character. Those projects were born out of the postulate to claim a room in the world, to confirm having been there, to make a difference, end quote. The general idea of such an architecture would be then highlighted by the influence of the concept of difference. But the way, or rather the pretext of uniting them in a unique list, this heterogeneous project seems to be inspired by the employment of Kantian schematism. This being, according to Kant, an instance whose aim is the unity of the diverse and intuition in view of production of objective knowledge, being transformed in Hayes of a guarantor of the architectural unity. In an original way, this transcendental character can state the independence of architecture regarding philosophy. It's written at the beginning of the article, stating that the images of the architectural thought have no less power than philosophy. We could then read this as a development of concept of Deleuze by a critical view of this statement. We can ask this question: Hayes' process, would it be a process to integrate in this theoretical vision the arguments of the post-critical movement regarding the influence of philosophy over architecture in the 80s and 90s, an attempt to transfer the autonomous status of architecture in the conceptual level without annihilating the autonomy of architecture, with welcoming the diversity of approaches. There is seemingly in this project of integration very alluring an underlying contradiction. It theoretizes the scheme as a non-temporal aspect with the Kantian. Everything happens as if beneath very different approaches of doing architecture, participative architectures and generative architectures, the same voice, internal voice, is archaic and non-timely, stating that it's architecture. For Hayes, this voice is embodied by Lowes and his sentence, reaction to a pyramid found in the forest. This is architecture. This is how Hayes tries to theorize. The problem would be to add the concept preceding the sensible with the indetermination of the aesthetic judgment who owes everything to the sensitive. Difficult to solve, but it's not impossible. I don't have the time to do that, but Daniel Payot, in his item, The Judgment of Architecture, was getting to a seemingly similar issue. Attribute a status, determined status to architecture that would always be between the objective and the subjective, between determined and the reflecting. The solution would go through the status of common sense, who in the case of architecture is not presupposed but who's effective. Conversely to a beautiful object for what each and everyone should act as if the feeling was shared, the architecture is a given as already a representation of the common. Hayes seems to start from there. There's an obviousness of architecture that the the idea itself is recovering an obviousness that is not to be quoted but should be given. You just close your eyes and you represent yourself, the architecture, and you will have something to see. I mean, something in your mind. To conclude, I'd like to say that the idea of haze seems to raise many issues from the point of view of Kant. The interpretation of schematism and the model of its application in architecture suggested by Unger's would probably be more faithful to the letter of the criticism if we welcome the idea of haze as a construction of a reconciliation of a contemporaneous myth of the transcendental dimension of architecture, enabling to get out of the dialectic of good and the evil. It deserves to be discussed. As Michel Foucault says, there's no freeing machine. Freedom is always an issue of practice. Like the novels, reconstructing their casus, we have to construct our idea of archaic in architecture. Thank you.
Christelle Macchiaro.
Christelle Macchiaro is an architect, assistant professor. She is TPCAU, Theory and Practice of Contemporary Architecture. Research fellow at Marseille. She's preparing a project projecting in a model beyond the plane, the material as a rule for the model. At ENSA Versailles, directed by Paolo Almaldi, a friend of mine. So research interrogates definitions, representations, and teachings, crossing practices, teaching, and research to show how, in the digital era, to project in 3D directly without using a plan. Physical layout allows you to establish rules by modeling matter. She already published a lot of works this year. I'm a bit ashamed myself. And in particular, wait a second, where is this? Oh, this is interesting, very interesting. You don't have that much either, is there, says Madame Macchiaro. Oh yes, the end of the hegemony of plan in architectural design. I'm very much interested in that, because plans are important to me, and models are as well, but we will talk about that later on, I'm sure. The title of a conference in projecting in models, elementary operations of transformation of matter and the transposition of materials. I don't know how to speak slowly. I don't know how to speak slowly, but I will try. For the interpreters, I understand. I'll make an effort. Yes. Homo faber. We all have a bit of homo balis in us. In our childhood, we all stacked up and wrote pebbles, dug into unshaped sand, cut and assembled branches, full plain experience, how does this stick together, when does it fall, what's inside. There may not be projects in the Boutinian sense of operatory anticipation that are fuzzy, characterized by an iterativity between conception and materialization. These are artifacts made with their hands. These acts of doing are also acts of thinking. I decide to stack up pebbles. I look for regular and flat stones, a large one for the base, taking it, weighing its weight, looking at its temperature, its surface. I put it on the ground that's chosen carefully. I look for the best adherence. Then I take the second one that I adjust, following the balance by and by. I'm a part of matter. I'm facing gravity. My gest spatialize my thought, give form to that which has no form. I take ownership of the world. Sometimes it all falls apart and I start again. and with experience, I carry out variations. My expertise improve. I acquire know-how on matter and spaces. Initial gestures are archaic and universal, bearing memory and projects, closely linked to language, are a part and parcel for individual history and our collective ancestral history that dates back to cutting flintstone. What remains of these gestures in the architectural projects of today? In the 90s, the world, we entered the digital era and we realized the fineness of the earth, leading to a new perception of matter. On the one hand, substances, exhaustible natural resources, on the other hand, processes and infinite immaterial flows. Architecture historians have shown the emergence of non-compositional projection strategies with non-choice. Architects also started to produce physical models to project as if to show the conception process. This excessive production is still not being interrogated. From now on, many design directly in volume. If geometry and typology are there to second the plan, what about the model? Above and beyond the design model, I'm interested in the project, not being uniform. I look at the start of the project. When the architect thinks of an architectural project that is within the discipline itself, the project is both theoretical and practical. The traces of thought that led to it reside in its materialization. I focus on the real production of the architect, what he produces with his hands, drawings and models. In particular, the latter, the only representation exploring space in real space, alone between intellectual abstraction and material construction, an idea materialis like the project. It is often dependent upon the form of representation and what influence the production of the model does it have on the project. Literature often speak about its, much has been said about Book 2, materials and de re edificatoria. But what about the relationship between modulis and materia? There's a hypothesis between hylomorphism and morphogenesis. Matter, is it the rule behind the model, that of the project in the form and space? Alberti advocates simple, bare models made of other materials that I will interpret as a monomaterial of all sorts, wood, clay, or anything, without any scale or texture, abstract, enabling a modeling simplification of reality, which is necessary for the project. The statua described statuaries as elementary elements of transforming matter, modeling, adding, sculpting, subtracting, molding, multiplying. These operations are good to produce different objects, but for a model to make it a project, you must add another material, divide, like the planks in an Albertian model, like the wall with marrow, divide or balance out for linear elements, divide and fold for surface elements, divide, stack and juxtapose for modules. Like Leroy-Gourand, this leads to a relationship between the elementary operation of transformation and the elementary operation of transposition, plus matter equals tool and model. By combining them, these operations model matter, like the ratio between space and form for the building to be erected. They call into question the assembly of the parts and therefore the unit through the trilith or the monolith. Now, the most common category dates back to Renaissance period, stacking up, juxtaposing, or planks of the model, which are like a stone wall, coupled to be added. This category has already shifted in paradigm within the model in modern times, when the model became a mass model made of plaster, full or blind, becoming model space made of plates, hollow and transparent, like a veil visible on the sides. The carton model crossed the 20th century until it was exhausted. and becoming a non-compositional strategy. The addition of parts by stacking, juxtaposition, or balance, establishing a hierarchy and unity, and this was renewed with the conception of models, exploring phenomenologically not just space, but an environment thanks to materials, depending on the materiality, the implementation of the typological nature. We saw development of different forms of designing, taken from subtracting, molding, and folding, replacing all of this with a process linked to the acts of doing in connection with matter. Its form would therefore be deduced, and therefore this would be a non-choice. Given the time left, I will now focus on subtracting, stacking, and I will analyze the Y2K house. Like the Van Disburg artist's home, it illustrates the shift from one material to another, from carton to an extruded polystyrene foam, two theoretical projects reflecting architectural problems. Coulas declares wanting by instinct to come back to something silly and simple by instinct. It's that archaic, originally, the encounter between an iconic form and a collage of elements of a canonical element. We have a space with a design that is mainly made of models. In the first one, made of carton, the house reduced to a tunnel is like a body where all the organs are outside and the skin is inside, smooth inside and rough outside. It's all composed by addition, stacking, and juxtaposition. We look for a balance based on what criteria. Coulas calls this as odd form, not like anything else in architecture. The layout seems at random, the aesthetics as well. It may be this model that I redid, or this one, or something else. In the next model, the tunnel integrates the organs within the internal periphery, or the opposite, smooth outside and irregular, inside. The organs are interchangeable. Other models in carton try to integrate the organs in an irregular thickness outside the tunnel. This is clearly like a void, the organs like a mass. The models are in foam that you can dig into contrary to carton, but you can't change your line of reasoning that easily from carton to foam, from designing space to the void, from trilite to monolith. Models are also made by adding and stacking and juxtaposing. Let me try to slow down, thank you. The thickness of the frame, the opening, and so on. Nevertheless, a new line of reasoning is afoot. The umbilical shape of water rooms is typical of using a hot thread for cutting. In the final analysis, only a void at the center of a solid, which includes all the rest. There's nothing, you no longer have the parts to assembly, to pile up, or to juxtapose. I'm thinking of a reflexive practitioner, and I want to produce this, to find the act of doing and thinking through the operational chain. It doesn't work. Okay, subtracting, sculpting, dividing, stacking will disappear in connection with the polystyrene foam. What type of modeling will we obtain for them? We need to prepare the work. I bring together materials. The foam by texture and color is totally abstract. It's used for its density and the fact that it can be dug into. I'm not choosing any scale for the model. I adjust its dimensions to the material, the thickness of the plank. The first model will be a trial. I have to do it several times. Remove the surplus in the vertical plane from a block and using points to identify the edges of the tunnel in the axis, those of the apartments and the resulting edges, I subtract the material, program and context already induce a form. I obtain an extruded form and an intermediary form that are difficult to imagine before and during the work. The polyhedra enables you to have imprecise dimensions and angles, contrary to the geometry of the plane. What can be removed is thrown away, no value. Removing the surplus in the horizontal plane, the openings in the tunnel and the apartments are used as for you to identify things. Either I do it in one go or I do it little by little. During the production, I project the figure to come. The polyhedra obtained is like a wrought stone, what is removed is also thrown away. I think of the stone worker and a mixture of empirical know-how and improvisation. In 2 and 3, which we just saw, I focus on the fun to be extracted rather than the figure to be obtained, as opposed to the composition by addition, where the attention is focused on the form to shape. It's no longer the polyhedra to be obtained as archaic, but rather the process to obtain it. And then, first of all, remove the large piece. The original models are not in one block because the form of the figure, the size of the model and the tools prevent certain cuts. I admit that cutting the polyhedra to obtain the tunnel, the volume has 2 values. It's a clear-cut figure. Thus, the polyhedra from a figure becomes a substance. But the form obtained is also a substance because it's a void, contrary to design by addition. I give form to void and not to the full part. What is removed is kept. This is a total reversal. Let's remove the small parts. I repeat the same operations for each secondary void, the sides and the roofing. To obtain them, I'm forced to cut the polyhedra. In 4 or 5, I focus on the forms to be extracted from the base, easily projectable, as if to add, whereas I'm subtracting. These forms, like the procedure to obtain them, are no longer archaic, but knowledge, because they play with the figure and the substance. Each void has a unitary form. Yes, I'll try. I can't do everything. I'm speaking gently. To be forced to remove the void from the largest to the smallest, that means establishing a hierarchy. The void, is it now composed in phases 2, 3, and 4 at each step? If I remove too much matter, I start it all over again. With carton, I only reproduce the elements where I failed. Addition authorizes hesitations in iterativity. Subtraction, very little or not at all. Assembly and finishing. The goal was to obtain a raw form with the direct cuts, with the only constraints being matter and tools, but I must put together the pieces that were removed. They are dependent upon each other, though. The polyhedra is therefore monolithic, formed of a continuous material, associated with alternance between figure and substance. Topologically brings together internal and external. The modern spatial continuum gives way to the contemporary material continuum. Strategies of the void, communication, projectual versus process. The storyboard of the concept model of the strategy of void in Y2K becomes a communication strategy, showing the process that produced the form, which is nothing else than the synthesis of the operational chain. The omnipresent man's induced movement and spatialize the genesis of the void by subtraction, isolating or removing one of the steps will make the process inapplicable. It is meaningful only when complete. Another way, maybe, of generating unity. If iteration means the movement to and fro between design and materialization, the process is a movement forward, unavoidable, a trajectory. No room left for hesitation. The form obtained cannot be discussed. This process is a project and is mixed with it. The model becomes status and changes the status and becomes, I made a mistake here, and becomes a model in the sense of modulus, measuring and regulating matter, and modeling it by transformation and transposition. And the model becomes a model in the sense of modulo, transposable to other situations. Colloque doesn't show it all. The assembly of the voice refers us back to the full bodies in the initial models. The polyhedra can easily be apprehended from outside, but articulation, no. Furthermore, the base, cylindrical and therefore unstable, leads us to a decellularization. The model is immersive and immersive. During manipulation, Colloque notes an omnidirectional view at the course of the voids. The house can pivot so that someone can view it, can steer it towards the landscape that they like to look at. 75 years after Van Doesburg, Colloque therefore designed an anti-gravitational house that rotates. Materialization, the polyhedra obtained Oma has been making trials in matters that may be transparent and translucent to make a mass inhabitable. From analogical, the model becomes homological, opening up to a new phase of materialization, less abstract, therefore moving from the problem of architecture to the project and moving away from the analogy between modeling matter and spatial structures in the construction. This research is materialized with La Casa de Música, designed straight away. Model and the structure are mixed up. The modeling matter has no scale, but as construction is not a model, it's a construction of elements whose component parts must be removed to make it monolithical. This leads to stability. Now, the polyhedra is finalized, hierarchies are internal, the backgrounds are assembled by a center going for the auditorium in natural lighting to small rooms between natural lighting, and the second in the auditorium with a creamy artificial lighting. After the Industrial Revolution, we see an oscillation between permanence and resurgence despite the shift in paradigm. We see a sort of resistance, reassurance to face a new beginning or just an evolution. The blue foam model by Y2K is just a pretext to understand relations between gestures, matter, and design models. This changes our relationship with the projects. The model offers an apparent synthesis, and it satisfies our needs for the immediate, gendered by the digital. Everything mixed up, concept, design with the production process. The relationship between subject and object is reduced to the minimum. To remove a few screens between us. My object is here. A project or a plan is no longer projected before me. I'm losing track here with the intellectual and abstract distance of geometry. My vision guiding iterations. My object, a process or model is now in my hands. The product of their gestures, thoughts. I'm in and outside of my object. Haptics guides what is more of an IT narration. Gestures push the secondary predominance of vision. Doing it in a model pushes the perspective viewpoint. Very prosaically, as far as I'm concerned, in an era of virtual spaces without gravity or materiality, digital based on processes, I'm trying to find once again the rules of matter to teach, to show the project directly in volume, a physical model or digital model to little kids who did not necessarily stack up pebbles on the beach. Thank you.
Thank you.
Donc voilà, donc en 1964,
In 64,
Fumiko
Maki published a collection of projects
dans un ouvrage intitulé Investigation
in a book
in Collective
entitled
Form.
Investigations in
À travers cette
Collective Form.
publication, Maki
Through this
nous fournit deux
publication,
textes à la fois
Maki
théoriques et
provides us
didactiques,
with two texts,
qui sont
both
ensuite
theoretical and
suivis d'une série de
didactic,
projets
which are then
illustratifs de la
followed
troisième
by a series
catégorie
of
de formes
illustrative
collectives
projects
que
of
Maki
third
avance,
category of
à
collective
savoir la
forms,
forme de groupe.
the group form.
Les deux autres formes
The other
collectives
two
sont
collective forms are
respectivement la forme
respectively the
compositionnelle et
compositional
la
form
mégaforme.
and the mega
Dans le cadre de
form.
cette conférence sur les
In
potentiels
this
de
conference on the
l'archaïque,
potential of
sur la
archaic, on the
recherche d'un
search for an
archaïsme qui
archaism that
persiste au
persists
passage du temps,
and withstands
nous
the passage of
concentrerons sur la
time, will
forme de
focus on the
groupe,
group
qui est
form,
selon Maki
which
l'expression
according
d'une
to
forme
Maki
qui
is the
évolue à partir de
expression of a
systèmes
form that
d'éléments
evolves from a
générateurs dans
system of
l'espace.
generating elements in
Ces éléments
space.
générateurs sont l'expression des usages.
These
Construisant un
generative
système de
elements
relations
are the
spatiales
expression of
d'usage qui
uses,
peuvent
building a system
perdurer
of
et
spatial
se transformer
relations
dans
and
le temps,
uses which can
sans pour
continue and
autant
change over
en
time
altérer la
without
structure
altering
primaire.
its primary
Cette réflexion de
structure.
base
This
se base sur
reflection is
l'observation des
based
villages
on the
traditionnels
observation of
grecs et
traditional
soudanais.
Greek and Sudanese
Maki nous
villages.
précise à leur sujet
Maki tells us about
que la
them
maison
that the
est
house
l'élément
is the
générateur de la
generating
forme
element
du village et
of the
vice-versa.
village form and
Une unité
vice
peut y être
versa.
ajoutée
A unit can
sans
be
changer
added
la
without
structure
changing the
basique du
basic
village.
structure of the
Cette
village.
capacité du système à
The ability of the
perdurer, à
system
se
to
modifier,
continue, to
est
persist,
selon
to
notre
change,
lecture
is
à la
according
fois
to our
l'expression
reading,
d'un archaïsme,
at the same time the expression of an archaism, a
perdurant dans notre
historical
société
category lasting in
contemporaine,
our contemporary
mais également
society,
d'une forme ouverte,
and of an open
capable de
form,
croître et de changer.
able of growing and
À ce
changing.
propos,
In this regard,
Maki s'appuie sur
Maki
le rapport
relies
d'une
on the
réunion du
report
Team
of a
10 de
meeting
Volcker,
of
se
Volcker's
référant
Team
lui-même au Hansen,
10, referring himself to Oscar Hansen, and speaks of his interest into an open aesthetic able of responding to change. Macky participates of the Team 10's meeting in 16, Bagnols-sur-Cèze. Group form has, according to Macky, a capacity of growth and change, able to endure and resist the passage of time, to adapt to human appropriations and the contingencies of the moment. This is made possible by a process of dispersal of units on gatherings. This aptitude of the group form to cross the time, to constitute a way of open conception, possessing an indeterminacy character, by using elementary procedures embodied in the agglomerate, is representative of a figure of expression falling within the archaic in the field of contemporary architecture. In this regard, a publication of the Japan architect in 2010 updates the question of the community, whose framework revolves around the text of Macky, while integrating the work of 14 other architects. The challenge of this publication was an update of collective forms. What exactly are the characteristics of this collective form? This group
exploré durant toute sa carrière.
In addition to dispersing units, Macky gives us, in the second text of the 1964 edition, a supplement on the formation of collective forms. Going through the definition of links, Macky describes these links as in physical terms in order to shed light on the operational nature, how to create links. He gives us 5 categories of links, which can be taken separately or combined, respectively denominated as follows: mediation, definition, repetition, arrangement or functional sequences, and finally, selection. These operating categories require a definition because they will allow to release a grid of contemporary architectural intervention as the expression of an archaic form. Mediation. Macky gives the following explanation: connect using intermediate elements or suggest links using spaces emphasizing the cohesion of the masses around them. The elements of mediation can take different materializations as to connect places, a roof, or places like Amsterdam, Venice. Definition: the act of defining oneself by circumscribing a piece or a land or a wall or any physical barrier, thus distinguishing it from its surroundings. This circumscription, can take the form of a wall, a railroad, a canal. Macky also tells us that building a wall around several elements connects them visually, even if they have nothing in common. Later in Macky's project developments, this definition could take the form of a podium, which connects several buildings. At the architectural scale, this definition operation can be likened to the Haka dwelling, a set of dwellings contained in a circular peripheral enclosure. Hermann Herzberger adds that these dwellings appear to be similar to a structuralist approach. We can continue to see a distinction between a relatively structured part, inclusive, as defined as inclusive, containing part of an under-constructed part, created and presumably circumstances and transformable to suit any new situation. It's the elements which are inside the diagram here. Herzberger adds that this physical form of the Haka is the expression of an open structure obtained by a process of interpolation, which consists in the definition of a different perimeter, a broad form, which can then be filled according to the uses. Repetition. For the Japanese architect, it is a matter of linking to the introduction of a common factor, each of the fragmental parts existing to the situation. The common factor can be formal, material, functional, or historical. The link is also defined by the size and shape of the interspaces between the repeated elements. The whole gives a collective form, expressing a texture, a grain, in the sense that Kevin Lynch expressed it. Repetition also expresses a process of open form and dynamic cellulorism in the sense meant by Sterling, designation of an architecture composed of several elements, repetitive or varied. Unit assembly is more like growth and change than simple addition. By approaching conceptually to Sterling worlds, Macky undeniably places the search for a group form in a context of indeterminate and open design. This way of thinking, Herzberger refers to it as a process of extrapolation, multiplying basic spatial units. This basic element constitutes, once assembled, what Macky will call later genetic forms or patterns. Arrange a sequential journey. In a route of this type, building up portions of multi-purpose buildings which are arranged in a sequence of useful activities, accompanying a path along an axis designed as major. Finally, design or reinforce a path in the natural landscape to catalyze and guide future developments. To select, act of connection, creation of unity prior to the design process by the choice of the site. The location is characterized by remarkable elements that will confer a visual unity to the project. It can be a hilly site, a hill, an island. These operational categories and the definition of the group form are theoretical concepts that have been developed by Mackey to bring out structuring principles in the production of a collective form at the scale of the city. In the late 60s, Mackey perceived the limits of unattainable at designing large-scale projects. To solve this equation, the architect suggested that each project he would improve just a small part of the city, defining what Jennifer Taylor will name sequential group form, or what Mackey will call later microscale planning. This intervention on a reduced scale consists of considering the city as a multitude of fragments that must be invested one by one. Mackey used the term fragment for the first time in 1974, telling us the city has been intensely fragmented. Beginning of the 70s, in the context of the profound questioning of these global models, Smithson wrote a series of articles in which they reconsider the notion of collective and suggest a change of point of view. Starting from an architectural theory based on massification for the greatest number, they suggest to move towards a fragmentation, toward a model of augmented diversity, offering more individual liberties. The most prominent article indicating this reorientation is repeated in The Violent Consumer, or Waiting for the Goodies, written in 1974, after the abandonment of the Robin Hood Gardens. I'm quoting the idea of
compartmenting in free choice is worth trying. Fragmentation says that the pieces each become the size and man's mind, responding to those demands in society that are pulled apart at the moment. The wish for anonymity or identity, the desire for patterns of association or disassociation, a turn away from the solution to be universally consumed towards solution, personally made or chosen, a return to different quality of life to be enjoyed in real pace.
This conceptual change in the project approach, no longer seeking to massify but to think of open structures at the fragment scale, as initiated in the reflection of Mackey and the Smithsons in the 70s, leads us to understand how we can look at the contemporary architecture, focusing not on urbanist town planning proposals, but on the architectural idiom of the grid of reading or identification of issues, the text of Mackey of '64. In his latest work, Jacques Lucan asks us about the tension towards archaism and whether it is possible culmination of a phenomenological approach. According to him, this approach uses elementary procedures such as stacking, to which we add the agglomerate or the repetition of basic unitary elements, forming the group form. This operation leads us to feel what the architects Herzog and de Meuron call, speaking of the Beijing Stadium showed by Lucan this morning, a spatial effect of an almost archaic immediacy. This act consisting of agglomerating forms containing the potential to form a coherent wall, a pattern, a group form, is representative of an archaic expression figure in the field of contemporary architecture and is emblematic, iconic for us, of a reactivation of archetypal figures of collective human settlements. What about the group form today? This is the project of Sanakanazawa, Museum of Contemporary Art. This cylindrical museum with a diameter of 112.5 meters can be read as a collective form, a form of group defined by a limit, creating a kind of enclosure. This enclosure, even if evanescent because of transparent glass, seeking to ensure a visual continuity between inside and outside, allows to ensure the same role as the medieval enclosure or the railroad, as Mackey said. Perimeter is defined, circumscribed, through a process of arranging a series of volumes based on elementary geometric shapes square circle. The ensemble provides a fragmentation of the interior space. However, it's a consistent. The outer limits requires a value of stability primary, and the volumes appear to be part of a secondary system, elements that can be interchanged without affecting the overall system, generating the other elements of interpolation as Herzberger brought them. Regarding the Towada Art Center of Nishizawa, the project proposed here has 16 volumes on the site, such an all-over device resembling a cloud. There's no apparent order, but yet the project proposes to create a building that can be experienced as a small town, as if the visitors were traveling from independent house to independent house. The city experience is reinforced by the fragmented nature of the project, in tune with the surrounding urban fabric. Those scattered elements are connected by a glazed corridor mediating within the project, as Mackie's words. This is the link which, in addition to the repetitive nature of materials, unifies the intervention of Nishizawa, even if it appears chaotic. Su Fujimoto's project of house near the Seto Island near Hiroshima dispersed 13 volumes on the heavily hilly side. These volumes contain respectively 2 housing units. Pathway generated in the natural landscape is designed in such a way that it combines houses and walkways in such a way that the surrounding landscape seems to extend nature. The set is also to compose a sequential path, augmented by the repetition, since it's to repeat 13 times the same elements. In conclusion, I can say that those explorations enable to situate our subject seeking to identify paradigmatic models derived from the founding text of Mackie. The theoretical concepts developed allow us to look at the contemporary architectural idiom, reading this reading grid in the original text of Mackie. We identified permanences in the design of a project. By the use of repetition and the identification of a permanency of the model, group form seemed to be a collective figure of the archaic persisting today. Thank you.
First published in 1955, Lucan's Devore House remains still today subversive and outside categorization. Through an examination of Devore and taking up the provocation announced in the conference call for papers to theorize composition strategies of division and dissociation per se, I hope to reveal in what follows specific architectural manifestations of division, separation, and to a lesser degree of the archaic at work, the archaic in the wide sense under discussion. Three propositions underlay the study. I conjecture, firstly, that Kahn's unbuilt project is characteristic of a swerve from modern movement morphological and space paradigms. I suggest, in other words, that at the time of its formulation, the project functioned as an unanticipated launch of a different sensibility, one that remained unrealized and untheorized some 20 years later at Kahn's death in 1974, and one still awaiting resuscitation. I propose, secondly, that in Devore House, an underlying temperament and composition strategy of spacing is at work, one manifest in gestures of division and separation, and resonant with and sharing traits of what might be characterized as the archaic, though this latter is only obliquely developed in what follows. I suggest, finally, that this other strategy of disposition signals what can be considered a radical departure in plan composition, departing from known types, unlike Beaux-Arts cross-axial distribution, Cubist collage fragmentation, and modernism's free plan infinite grid. This other approach, I suggest, is sufficiently different to remain unexploited to this day. Within the limits of this brief study, analysis and demonstration will be necessarily cursory, but I nevertheless hope to frame the elements of the question and contribute to approaching the conference theme of figures of expression, also announced in the call for abstracts. I also aim to make a modest addition to the existing literature on Kahn, expanding on and varying important findings of others, including David Brownlee and David DeLong, Peter Eisenman, Kenneth Frampton, Romualdo Jurgala, Vincent Scully, and Allison and Peter Smithson. The terms of reference and findings have been considered over the course of the study, and I'll return to those in concluding comments where I set out possible future lines of research. I've benefited from access to materials held in the Kahn collection, University of Pennsylvania, and reference materials from that archive. In 1955, Kahn publishes 2 drawings of Devore House. Across a double-page spread are published an elevation sketch of Devore and a diagrammatic building and site plan. Here the drawings are paired on the spread with sketches for Kahn's Adler House from the same years and a short text by the architect. Publication occurs in volume number 3 of Prospecta, the Journal of the Yale School of Architecture, the issue also containing documentation around Kahn's project for the Edith Jeshoram Synagogue, Philadelphia, unbuilt, and the just completed Yale Art Gallery and Design Center, New Haven. From an interrogation of the drawings and text that accompanied Kahn's original publication of Devore, a number of architectural issues and conditions are evident. While other issues exist, 3 stand out: the disappearance of the line, a strategy of separation that favors the informal, and a singular approach to plan composition. In what follows, I'll sketch out aspects of each. Devore comes after Kahn's time in Rome as resident architect at the American Academy in 1951, after his meeting with the Mediterranean archaeologist Frank Brown. In the same year, after Kahn travels to Egypt and Greece, and after the Yale University Art Gallery commission. It is, as Jurgala and Mehta note, a departure from his house designs up to that moment. And the plan for the Weiss House can serve as a placeholder, 1949-1950. A number of traits are evident in Kahn's work of the 1940s, and they are overturned or at minimum abandoned in the project for Devore, 1950. Key characteristics and overall temperament and ambition visible in Devore include a turn toward shadow and mass as distinct from a desire for transparency, an interest in isolation over simultaneity, and an attraction toward pure geometries over free forms. These together signal a shift away from the line as a shorthand for a sensibility that in certain histories of the period claimed domination in the modern movement thinking and expression. In other words, the disappearance of the line in favor of mass and geometric volume rendered in and yielding light and shadow, was already underway during Kahn's time in Rome and travels through Egypt and Greece. As a signal and single placeholder in sport of one of the design principles at work in Devore, that of the line's disappearance, we can take Scully's description of the differences in drawing manner of Kahn pre- and post-Rome. On the screen, a pre-Rome sketch. In an introduction to a collection of Kahn's drawings and paintings, Scully writes, quote, "Moved, one might say driven, by Le Corbusier's vision, Kahn moved to thin, linear, and planar perspectives in the 1940s, in which his architecture was clearly being drawn back and forth between, on the one hand, poles of geometric discipline, and on the other, physical attenuation," end of quote. This emaciated line, to take Scully at his word, would distract Kahn for some years, awaiting a catalyst to change, Rome being one of the catalysts in the 1950s. Scully continues, Le Corbusier's thin, pitiless, analytical line still helped direct Kahn's hand until an outward vision of the world and an inward vision of geometric order came together, end of quote. That Kahn moved beyond the physical attenuation and emaciation of the line of the earlier work is evident, for example, in the sketch, 1951, the year of the Devore House project, and in the deep physical shadows of the elevation study at Devore. Second aspect, separation, temperament. Let's begin with a phrase from the Two Houses text, which accompanied Devore's publication. quote, "In searching for the nature of the spaces of house, might they not be separated a distance from each other theoretically before they are brought together?" Separated distance from each other theoretically. In Kahn's aphoristic text accompanying Devore's 1955 publication, there's a clue to a specific attitude toward form generation, which I've called separation temperament. The compositional strategy at work in Devore, writes Kahn, is intended to avoid, quote, "a predetermined total form," end of quote. In its stead, Kahn advocates for singular architectural units that retain some kind of independence. In lieu of total form, Kahn argues for and draws, I claim, a formal spatial logic that favors the separation of units one from the other. This state of remaining a certain distance apart may be temporary, the condition in plan of separation holding for some undetermined period of time before the units settle into some kind of adjacency, however tentative. This strategy of separation or spacing is evident in Kahn's plan diagram. Here in the reverse figure ground, some scholars have favored. The 6 room units, each 8 meters to a side, can accordingly be read as if they are unmoored, and the plan that we see, therefore, is one possible stage in their drifting evolution. It is as if the state of form development we witness is suspended at one particular moment, and the 6 square rooms might at any time start to drift away again, buoyed by a desire for distance or alternately of attraction one to the other, moving or sliding to a line alongside another of the rooms in some kind of cluster configuration. And it'll be interesting to come back to the group form of Maki, writing at the same time. Shifts can also be assumed to be in response to topography and to existing trees on the site for Devore, the latter appearing to orbit around piers both in plan and elevation. Following Kahn's desire for distance or spacing as a strategy to resist total form, this plan diagram speaks with exceptional clarity of different kinds of relations, all of which can be claimed to demarcate different kinds of division. Reading left to right and top to bottom, 5 plan to pier or room-to-room conditions are evident and might be characterized as gap, abut, slip, detach, and to be attracted or held together by a third, in this case the retaining wall. For the purposes of this paper, these can be gathered together as a categorization of the general strategy of spacing. How this range of formal spatial relationships might have been maintained or varied or added to were Kahn to have continued with the project can only be speculated on. There are at least 2 extant partial plan studies with rooms occupied by use and furniture suggesting possible configurations at the room unit level, but not at the level of group form. So 2 drawings from the Kahn Archive in Philadelphia. Third architectural issue or condition, a plan idea. The drawings neatly render Kahn's concept of structure and architectural space as predicated on a constitutive element, a room demarcated by square piers and an experimental approach to form space making according to a logic of spacing. Accepting that interpretation, what category or what kind of plan is it? What variation or advance can be claimed for Kahn or out of Kahn? An examination of Devore reveals a plan idea that bears little residue of or resemblance to the binuclear and pinwheel plans that characterized Kahn's work prior to Rome, again looking at the Weisshaus as an example of the binuclear plan. It is also already distanced from Beaux-Arts cross-axially organized plans and Palladian 9 squares, with the Fleischer House in a poor reproduction from 1949-1950, representing the Palladian 9 square moment in Eisenman's work. Though Peter Eisenman has elegantly and with conviction suggested that traces of a 9 square plan still remain at work in Devore's unconscious. Devore also, I would argue, varies from the theoretically infinite extension of the modernist point column free plan. As David Brownlee and David DeLong point out, that is, it departs from an order that would allow one spatial unit to extend to another in a cellular ordering of space. An additional testimony additional evidence about the originating nature of the Devore House plan can be found in the Smithsons. 1974, the Smithsons turned specifically to Devore in a short text published in Oppositions, 1974, the piece written just prior to Kahn's death. Opening a different line of consideration in this taxonomy of plans which Devore avoids, it's worth noting the Smithsons' resistance to classifying the Devore, other than in opposition to what it's not. It's neither a barn nor a temple. The Smithsons effectively, though without developing the implications, describe the house as a force machine, both radiating outwards in a centrifugal motion and at the same time capturing and pulling inwards in a centripetal movement that works on space such that the void framed by piers is positively charged. To quote the Smithsons, quote, "The most mysterious, the most charged of architectural forms are those which capture the empty air," end of quote. Closing observations. 3 characteristics, I believe, are at stake in Devore and exemplify an architecture of distancing and spacing and sharing traits of what might be called the archaic, suggested above, and providing provisional responses to the 3 opening propositions. To the claim that Devore stands as further testimony of well-argued claims about Kahn's swerve from modern architecture paradigms, the evidence seems conclusive. To the proposition that form generation via division and separation as one sign of the archaic is at work and was a specific ambition for Kahn, the drawings and text in particular establish faith in that idea's capacity for realization. Finally, the plan and by implication structure and space idea, to all evidence, resists single categorizations, whether stylistic or aesthetic, all in a provisional support of an interpretation of Devore as signaling or provoking a swing away from other plan categories toward a plan concept whose potentials are still to be exploited. As a form of provisional conclusion, 3 further lines of research might include, on the one hand, an examination of Devore via the lens of the informal, or, to echo Jacques Lucan's use of the term this morning, the irregular. Hinted at above, quickly, the use of art historical developments such as those by Yves Lembois and Rosalind Krauss might be productive and provocative. A longer study of Devore should also properly interrogate the origins and genealogical implication of Kahn's aversion to total form. Really interesting, his absolute desire to avoid total form. Interesting genealogical problem, which might include looking at Gropius's Scope of Total Architecture, same year. Finally, Eisenman's analysis of Devore as an architectural text in diachronic space deserves further implication and further interrogation. The implications of all 3, the collateral possibilities for a renewed understanding of mid-20th century and contemporary projects, gives additional momentum to further research on this question of the notion of spacing and the productive lens of the archaic, which I hope to have opened today. Thanks.